Hi and welcome to this little tutorial on foundation paper piecing. So today I'm going to be showing you the basics of paper piecing, and at the end of it you will have made this beautiful little heart block. You can make 4 of them and turn them into a cushion, or make lots of different colours if you want and turn them into a quilt. So all foundation paper piecing starts with a pattern printed onto a bit of paper. So you can either print this from your computer onto a fine bit of paper, you can trace it. A lot of patterns that might come with the packs of paper printed on them already. So first thing you're going to do though when you get your pattern is you're going to have a look and decide on what sort of fabrics. Now the great thing with pieces like this is we're going to use up scraps. So I've grabbed all my scraps, I've ironed them all flat. You can see you can use the small bit of scraps quite easily. So I've ironed all of those flat and ready to go. So all the patterns you'll notice they are numbered. So that's telling you which number piece you're going to start with. And it's important to work in the order of the numbers. That way you end up with the piece laying correctly. What you will notice though is the pattern is the reverse of the final product. So you can see that on the heart by the line running here on this one, it's running this way on the other side. So if you are creating a pattern, that's important to remember is that the printed pattern needs to be the reverse of the final product. Because what we're going to do is if I flip this over, this is going to end up like this on the pattern. And what we do is we actually sew on each of these lines. Okay, so to get started. So the tools you're going to need other than your sewing machine is you'll need a small ruler, quilting ruler. If you've got an add a quarter ruler, that makes it a lot easier, but just a small ruler is fine. A rotary cutter. You'll also need a small mat, and I've got this great folder that has my ironing board on top and my cutting mat on the inside. So you also need an iron or some kind of pressing roller to flatten your seams out. Once you've gathered all your supplies, grab your printed pattern. We're going to trim down the paper a little bit, just so we don't have all that extra running through our machine. Making sure at this stage we're not cutting on the cutting line, we're just cutting a little bit around the outside. And it just makes it a little bit easier to handle by doing that. So what we're going to do now to make each step a little bit easier as we sew, we're going to fold each of these lines that you see printed on the pattern. So we're just going to grab that, we're going to fold it back on the line, and we're just going to run through and we're just going to fold each of those lines. It doesn't matter if the fold goes past where the line is, it's not going to be a problem. We just need to get those folded because this is a lot easier to do before you start sewing your pattern. So I'll run through all of these and I'll be back to you in a moment. Okay, so you can see I've now folded all the lines. Look, if you don't fold it perfectly on, it's no big deal. The reason we're folding these lines, I'll show you later, is just for when we're cutting our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So they don't have to be perfect if they come off a little bit. That's not a problem. You also don't need to fold the 2 outer lines. They are just the final block shape and seam allowance, so they're fine to leave as is. All right, so now we're going to grab our scraps. And we've got all those nicely pressed, and I've chosen the colour order I'm going to do. So you can see I've got them all lined up in the order. I've looked at the numbers in the order that I'm going to use. Now, before you start sewing, there's a couple of things you need to do with your machine. You need to make sure you're using a straight stitch. You also need to change your needle to a new needle, nice and sharp, to make sure that it is puncturing the paper neatly. And the other really big thing is we're going to change our stitch length down to 1 to 1.2 millimetres. The importance of that is as we're sewing our lines, we need to create a perforation on that paper. A standard 2 to 2.5 millimetre stitch length, when you're pulling the paper out, it will actually tear your seam, whereas a 1 to 1.2 is not going to tear that seam. Okay, so we're ready to do our first piece. So you can see here that this is piece number 1 and this is piece number 2. So if we look back at our main piece, remembering this is in the reverse, this is piece 1 and this is piece 2. So I need to find a piece of the nice pink with the little stripes and a white piece. And we're going to get those ready on the pattern. So here we have our piece of white, pink, and we have our piece of white. Now, you'll need to, when you have a look, we're actually going to end up with the wrong side of the pattern here being our face up. So as I said earlier, this is how we're going to be. So I need to look at the paper, excuse the blue lines of the paper I've printed on, and actually line up our piece that we're going to use to cover over where we're going to be sewing. So you can see that's it there. Now, for the first piece only, it is a little bit easier if you just use a fabric glue pen and just put a little bit of glue on that spot, and this is going to help that piece from slipping. I'm also making sure I've got my stripes lined up nice and straight on there, and I'm going to stick that down. Okay, now in order to make sure we're getting our next piece lined up, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our cutting mat and we're going to fold back on that number 1 line, and this is why we do our folds beforehand. And we're going to line our ruler up on our 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to just trim off the excess of that pink. So now I know that that is my 1/4 inch, and my number 2 piece is just under here. So I'm then going to, this might be hard for you to see, but I'm going to hold it up to the light and just check where that piece comes through, and I'm going to line my little triangle up so it matches. So then when I fold this back after I've sewn it, that's going to line up and be my corner piece. So let's have a look at that. We're going to sew that. Now, here's the tricky bit. We're sewing from this side. So you need to make sure you've got hold of your pieces, bring it up under the machine. There we go, I've already slipped off. So we're going to bring that up under the machine, and you're going to start about a 1/4 inch, or about 4 stitches before the line, and we're just going to sew along that line. Okay, use my lovely old mechanical sewing machine here, and I'm just going to cut that thread. I'm not going to trim all these threads up now, they'll be trimmed up later. So we've sewn on our line. You can see I've sewn pretty much right on the line. The good thing with these patterns is if you're not perfectly on, it's not going to matter. Now I'm going to flip to my ironing board side, and this is where if you just had a little roller, sometimes it's a bit easier, but I don't have one. I have my trusty little iron, and I'm just going to press that seam down. And there's our first piece done. Okay, now a little bit of extra fabric going on here, don't worry about that, we'll deal with the extras as we come to that piece. So if we flip back now, piece number 3 is in the middle. If we have a look at our pattern, the bit in the middle is another white piece. So I'm going to get another white piece of my scrap, and I now know that I'm going to be joining along this line. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to flip my pattern, put my pattern down, fold back on that number 3 line. Excuse me, I'll get to my cutting board here. Okay, so we're going to flip that pattern back on that folded line we made, and then we are going to trim our 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so we are now ready to place our next piece of fabric face down, and negotiate that into the machine and sew on the line for number 3. Okay, you can see I'm taking a few stitches past the line. We're going to open that out and iron it. Now, if you were doing this at home, you could probably have a separate cutting board to pressing board to make it a little bit easier for you, but for the sake of filming, it's good to have it all in the one spot. So I'm going to press that down, and there's number 3 done. At the moment, we're not really seeing the shape that we're creating here until we sort of start to move on to the next pieces. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a look now at piece number 4. So piece number 4 is here. So we're going to need to bring back and fold there. I've got some stitches coming into piece number 4. That's okay. What I'm going to do is I fold back on that line is just pop the paper a little bit. You can see it's popped through, hasn't broken the stitches, but it's popped through the bit of paper. And we're going to fold that back on line number 4, where we've already created the crease. And then we're going to trim number 4. And we're ready to attach piece number 4. So if we have a look at our pattern, piece number 4 is this piece. So we're going to find that heart piece in my scrap pile. I've got it right here. Now, this is a bigger piece than I'm going to need, but you're always best to have a bigger piece, because what happens if you watch here, piece 4 needs to end up here. If I just position my piece 4 like this, when I fold it back, it's not actually covering where it needs to be, which is up here. So sometimes it's actually easier if you grab your piece and you cut a 45-degree angle on your piece, and you can then position and go, okay, this is where I want my piece to end up. So you've cut your 45, so you then flip it up like that, and once we've sewn along here, that is then going to flip back and cover where we want it to be. All right, so it looks like it's not really in the right spot, but when we've sewn it, you'll see that it ends up back in the right spot. So lining up on the seam for 4. My cutting tools, get back to my ironing board there, and we are going to, now there we go, I didn't hold that very well and I've slipped a bit, but that's okay, as long as the piece is still covering where we need it to cover. Okay, I think my number 3 here might be a little bit short at this corner. We'll find out when we get there. All right, so up to piece number 5 now. So we'll flip that back. Fold back 4 now. At the moment, piece 4 is flapping around a little bit, so I'm going to put a tiny bit of glue just there, just to try and help keep it flat. And you only want a little bit, you don't want a heap of glue, because when we eventually tear these papers out, we're going to have to pull them off. So you just need enough to hold the stick while you're actually sewing. So we'll trim that excess piece off. And now back to our pattern, sorry about that. Back to our pattern, we want another white corner. So we'll grab our white corner, we'll pop it on just there, lining up neatly, and then we'll feed that through. Back to my ironing board, and we're going to fold that back. All right, so we're getting there. Done 5 pieces so far. So the next piece is piece 6, and it's a nice long strip. So we're going to cut that strip, folding on piece number 6. Little seam to pop there. You can see sometimes you end up with a little corner of paper sticking out. That's fine. So we're going to trim that down. If your ruler's not quite as long as your fabric, just run that along. All right, so piece number 6 is this nice floral piece here. It's a nice straight piece, easy to piece, making sure we've at least got a minimum 1/4 inch off each end of the pattern. I like to have 1/2 inch just to be sure, so you're not slipping. So we're going to make sure we're lining that up. And I know you can't see this, but I'll just hold this up to the light to make sure it's lining up properly. And then we're going to sew along there. Okay, we'll iron that flat, and this is where you'll now start to see how the rest of the piece is coming together. So we can now see, if we look at this, how that's starting to look like this one. So I'm going to pause the video here, finish sewing all these strips on, and then I'll come back to you. So I've just sewn piece 7 on. Now you can see here, this one starts to angle down. It's important when you're sewing a piece like this that you make sure that your fabric is longer than the longest part of the block. Don't get tricked and look down here, because you'll end up, when you fold it back, as being too short. So you can see I've actually got quite a long piece there, and we can fold that back and press that down. Okay, and I'm making sure I'm reaching to the end. All right, I'll be back soon. Okay, so I've finished sewing on all the stripes. So you can see if we have a look at the actual original, I've still got to do these corners here. Now, at the moment, I've left all these edges on the side. If you wanted to, you could come along and trim those back, but make sure you still leave about a ½ inch so you're not over trimming. But honestly, it's easy just to leave it till you come to putting that next step on. So I know I now need 2 triangles. So what I'm going to do, instead of just using a square piece and trying to line it up, I'm going to grab my square piece here, and I'm actually going to cut it down the middle. And I've checked to make sure this is going to be the right size, and I'm going to cut it here. And what I've done then is I've actually cut my triangles to fit. Now you can see though that they're a good ½ inch bigger on all sides, just to allow for my seam allowance. So we're now going to come back to our piece here. We're going to find which one next, and I'm up to number 11. So we'll bring that around, we'll pop those little seams, fold back on the line. Now you can see this is where you're actually going to trim off all those edge pieces. So that's why you don't have to worry about doing it beforehand. So we've trimmed all those off. Sometimes with the thickness you get a little bit extra thickness. We'll trim all those off. Okay, and so now we can position piece number 11, yes, right side up, on there, and run that through. So making sure I'm holding it. If you need to put pins to hold the pieces, if you're worried they're going to slip as you're sewing, you can do that. I like to just sometimes do a couple of stitches first, make sure it's still lining up, and then run it through. Okay, it's number 11. So we'll flip back to the ironing board, press that one out. Starting to see that heart shape coming through now. Takes a little bit to get there. So we'll now do number 12. Hold that back. Trim that off. Okay, and grab another one of our triangles. And sew. Now, I don't know if you can see here, but the pattern is actually starting to perforate itself and tear away. That's okay. Don't actually pull it all off until you've finished, but it's not going to matter for the moment. So So we'll press that one flat. All right, so we've got our heart shape. Our next step is we're just going to add our borders. So I'll add those on and I'll come back to you in a moment. Okay, so I've done the side borders. Now something you can do, because piece 13 and 14 actually aren't touching each other at all, you can prepare and attach both those pieces at the same time. Saves you one less trip to the ironing board and the cutting board. So we'll press both those pieces out. Okay, so now we've got the top and the bottom piece to do. Now you can see here, I mentioned earlier that I had a feeling my piece 3 might be a little bit short in this corner. So what we're going to do, we're going to pull that back and cut at the 1/4 inch and just have a look where we are. So we can see that really it's just on the sew line. So what you can do to, you know, maybe make sure that it's actually gripped in, and these are little changes you can do along the way without a big problem, is when you grab your piece and you pop it on, is just so, because in this pattern it's not going to matter, is actually just sew, instead of on the line, we're just going to sew just inside the line. And that way we're going to make sure that that piece is actually grabbing. So we'll do that now and have a look at it. So I'm sewing just to the inside of my line. Have a look and see if that's grabbed, and there you go. So you can see we can't actually see any of the fabric, any of the hole in the fabric. So press that back, and that is such a small amount that by the time you finish this block, you're not going to even notice that this block is a couple of millimetres shorter than this block. So I'm going to attach the other piece and I'll be back. All right. So we've got all the pieces sewn down now. Now, for those that have got a good eye, I don't know if you'll notice, I've actually sewn that top piece on upside down. I've sewn it wrong side up, but that's okay. I'm going to leave that for now. So what we're going to do now is we're now going to trim the block down along our seam allowance line. And we do this before we take the paper out, because then we make sure we're actually trimming it to the right spot. So, lining up. And trimming. Now, this small amount of trimming on a bit of paper is not going to blunt your rotary cutter anything that matters, but you don't recommend that you cut a lot of paper with your rotary cutter. Get a Stanley knife for that normally. So there we go, we've trimmed all 4 sides. You can see I've left, all my threads are hanging off. I don't worry about cutting them all until the very end, and half the time they're inside your quilt anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So there is our finished block, just the same as the other one. Okay, so now you're going to need to remove the papers. What you don't want to do though is just tear at it and pull them all out really quickly, because you'll end up tearing the stitches. You're going to do it carefully, fold over, pull, tear it off. You've got to find, you might find you have little corner pieces you have to get rid of too. When I do it, I like to do it in the opposite order of how I sewed it down to start with. So we'll just keep turning and pulling out all those papers. So I am going to pause there and finish pulling out all these papers and come back to you. There we have, all the papers are pulled out. So there is our completed block. So we'll have a look at our other one. There they are, just the same. So you could now go on to make more of these all in the same colour. If you do 4, it'll make a nice little placemat, little wall hanging. Do lots of them and you can make a quilt. One could even be a pot holder. I think I might go and make some more of these in maybe some other colours, so maybe green and blue, yellow, orange, and make a nice lap-size quilt. So really, a few things to remember when you're doing this is pop a new needle in to get started with so it pierces the paper nicely. You also need to change your stitch length down to about 1.2 is another thing to remember. And look, if you make a little mistake like we did at the top, we didn't quite come up far enough, you can adjust it. Just do your stitch line a little bit lower. It's going to still be fine. So thanks everyone for listening in today. For those that have joined us from the Great Australian Craft Show, you can always access again either on my Facebook page or you can go to my YouTube channel that I'm getting set up. It's called Creature Crafts Australia, and I'm going to be loading on lots more tutorials there of how to do things like this. So what I do have for you today though is I will upload a copy of this pattern for you to be able to download. I'll have it there for free. There'll be a link in the comments so you can download this and print it out yourself and have a go of doing the pattern. I will also be making up, if you like the particular print that I've used, I can make up some packs of the fabric of those for you to have a go at. So thanks again for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed everything I've shown you here. Any questions, feel free to either pop it in the comments section and I can answer it or send me a message. So thanks again for listening.